Republican entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, a political newcomer who sought to shake up the 2024 presidential race by challenging more established candidates, has announced that he was pulling out and endorsing Donald Trump.
As of this moment, we are going to suspend this presidential campaign. And this is going to have to be, there is no path for me to be the next president absent things that we don't want to see happen in this country.
Still on Iowa caucuses, Ron DeSantis has eked out a second place finish Monday, as U.S. media projected. This comes as the Florida governor sought to paint the Republican Party nomination as a battle between him and frontrunner Donald Trump. With most Iowa precincts reporting, CNN and Fox News says DeSantis, who would bet heavily on doing well in the state, won second place with 21.2% of the vote, narrowly ahead of the former UN ambassador Nikki Haley at 19.1%.
Well, our special correspondent Karl Bostic joins us now from Tel Aviv to discuss more on this. Thank you so much for joining us, Karl. Decisive and historic win for Donald Trump in Iowa last night. Many predicted this, but could you give us some more details about what exactly this means for the race to the Republican nominee, for the Republican Party, and also for Donald Trump's chances to return to power as president?
Well, as far as Donald Trump and his campaign are concerned, the train has left the station. In other words, he laid down his marker. In other words, just judging from what happened last night, but to put it into context, it's this. Yes, Iowa is the first state to hold some form of balloting for the nominee for this year. Donald Trump won decisively, 51%. Historical margins, if you combine DeSantis and Haley together, they still fell short. And that's really part of the problem because the next voting will be in New Hampshire. That's next week. That's a primary. If anything right now, what we're seeing for Republican nominee, we're seeing it's a race to be number two. Who amongst the candidates can maybe, be a clear number two, if not an alternative to Donald Trump? What sets apart maybe New Hampshire from Iowa is that you have really more of a moderate to conservative voting base. In Iowa, you had a strong evangelical base. You had moderate conservatives. That's what DeSantis and Haley were playing to, but still was not enough because clearly Donald Trump has that, as Joe Biden referred to, that MAGA base. Those people, that base that's basically looking past all of his, shall we say, shortcomings. I mean, here's someone facing 4 criminal cases, 91 counts. In fact, he's going to New York today to appear in a civil case against him. Yet the point is, his supporters are looking past all of those, what would be, shall we say, character flaws in any other candidate. They're looking past that because of his charisma. And it's also maybe a statement for the kind of leader they think America needs right now. A lot of people out there in America, they feel as that maybe, representative democracy doesn't always work, especially when you have a world with the problems we have today. Maybe you need one with more of an authoritarian bent, which Donald Trump surely represents. But to put things in context of just how much of a landslide this was, I mean, yesterday you had record low temperatures in Iowa, minus 40 degrees freezing. After 30 minutes, when polling started last night at 7 p.m., they already closed the race for Donald Trump. They had not even set up his campaign ballroom for popcorn and drinks to announce him. The staff hadn't even shown up yet, and people were still listening to speeches before they voted. So that's how clear-cut and decisive it was. That said, let's say he is the nominee for Republicans. What they also announced in one of the polling that was taking was that 30% of Republican voters feel that if he's convicted in any of his criminal cases, he is unfit to be the next president of the United States. So while he may be the Republican nominee, it remains to be seen what his chances are to win election, return to power again, especially if he's convicted in any of these cases.
Well, Karl, while we're talking about elections, history is also being made in the UK with more voting rights for overseas Britons. Can you let us know your thoughts on that?
Well, this is really historic. If you're British and if you live overseas, very simply put, up until now, if you lived outside of Britain for more than 15 years, but you lived overseas, you were not eligible to vote. But that's unlike many democracies ranging from U.S., Italy, Canada, countries like those in France, which do allow overseas residents to vote unconditioned for the rest of their life. In Britain, it's always been a hard, fast rule that if you live outside of the UK for more than 15 years, you cannot vote. This has been a 20-year-long campaign. And then finally, a secondary vote was taken in Parliament in December of last year. In other words, a few weeks ago. As of today, if you live overseas and you're British, it doesn't matter how long you lived overseas, you can vote in the next election. And that's important because we're looking at a general election as early as this year to choose the next ruling party, to choose the next prime minister of Great Britain. We're talking 3.5 million British living overseas, primarily in countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, and other European countries. You know, for years and years and years, critics are supporters of this rule to exclude Britons. Basically said, well, what do they know about issues and policies in Britain if they don't live in Britain for more than 15 years? And the pushback has been, which is, valid when you consider what the issues that they're concerned with is like, well, even though we live overseas, we do care about our rights for health care. We do care about care for the elderly, especially if we have parents living in the UK. We do care about education policies if our children are returning to the UK for university or secondary school, for example. And then finally, we do care about immigration policy, especially if spouses of British residents are non-British. So those are the kinds of issues that make this next election relevant for someone living overseas. And to put things in perspective, those 3.5 million Britons who may be eligible to vote, they have to prove that they lived in Britain and where they lived and maybe were even registered. That's more than twice the difference of the vote margin that allowed Britain to leave the EU. So that would have made a significant difference on whether or not, for example, the UK even left the EU, if perhaps they had been allowed to vote.
And Karl, you've been in Israel for over 100 days since this war began. Is it entering a new phase?
Well, that's what's really perplexing a lot of people right now, because now it's day 102. Last night, the defense minister is saying that the military was entering a new phase after 3 months of a ground invasion and aerial bombardments. They are now withdrawing troops from north and central, not all, but some, like a brigade, at least from north and central Gaza, still leaving a significant portion in the south. A lot of work still to be done. Keep in mind what the objective had been. The main objectives had been to dismantle Hamas so that they can no longer operate in Gaza, to bring home all the hostages, and to make sure that this never happens again. Well, yesterday they began withdrawing a brigade of Israeli soldiers from central Gaza yesterday. This morning, more than 50 rockets were fired into southern Israel. And that's important for a number of reasons. One, it says that, okay, if you're saying you have operational control, how come they can still fire 50 rockets? And because they fired them at one location, even though they've got this Iron Dome anti-missile system, which has more than a 90% interception rate, if you're firing more than 50 rockets, you only get maybe 90% of it. And as a result, some did actually hit buildings in one of the small border communities. Fortunately, there are no casualties, but there was a lot of damage on the ground. And this is one of the arguments being made about how can we trust this government if they're saying we've got operational control, and then the next day, more than 100 days later, we were seeing all these rockets being fired. And then the concern is that we still maybe have not seen the worst of it, because we're now seeing escalating crossfires in the northern front, the northern border with Lebanon. So at the very least, this looks to be a very, very long year, unfortunately, here in Israel. You consider its fronts from Gaza, the Lebanese border, the West Bank, and even the Houthis in the Red Sea.
That's indeed unfortunate, but we're certainly grateful for your time here on Newsday. Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic, live from Tel Aviv. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time.